I will be happy to tell you that David is a member of Citizens Climate Lobby, a grassroots organization that lobbies for bipartisan support and solution to climate change. We purposefully waited to schedule David until after the election, thinking that the picture might be a little different. I'm not sure whether it is or not, but David's going to tell us. So, David, thank you for joining us, and we are looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, so everybody mute themselves so David can have the floor.
So I'll try to leave some time at the end for questions. So I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, good. Okay, so as Sue said, I'm from an organization called Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'm going to talk about this organization and our particular solution to climate change. Susan, who's also on this call, is a member as well, and a very active member, and so she may be able to chip in a little bit as well. First, why did I get into climate change? I mean, I've always been interested in it, but about 4 years ago, or almost exactly 4 years ago, I got considerably more interested in it and decided to become more active. And my son, who's shown here holding a Rotary coin that my uncle gave him, it's been a motivation for me to get involved in this because of the what we're leaving behind for them and our responsibility to them. And Citizens Climate Lobby and Rotary have a lot of connections right now and a lot in common. And the four-way test really does apply quite well to Citizens Climate Lobby and its goals. So what I'll do in this talk is first give a fairly brief overview about what we know about climate change and more importantly, where the science currently stands. So, you know, what is the current status of it and what can we expect over the next decades and century? Second, what is Citizen Climate Lobby's particular solution? And then I will talk specifically about the federal and state bills that Citizens Climate Lobby supports. Okay, so what do we currently know about climate change? The basics, which I imagine are familiar to most of the folks in this group, that varies greatly depending on what group I'm talking to, but I imagine most of you are familiar with the basics, which is that burning fossil fuels produces carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And those greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a lengthy period of time, depending on the gas, and they enhance a natural greenhouse effect. So naturally, we do have an atmosphere that allows sunlight in and traps heat, which is why the Earth is warmer than surrounding space. If you go to the moon or Mercury, the dark side, when the sun is not shining on it, is extremely cold because all the heat escapes. So we need an atmosphere and we need greenhouse gases to keep in the heat to make the planet habitable. Though when you add more greenhouse gases than you would naturally get from normal processes, you increase that blanket and it causes the Earth to warm up more than it otherwise would. Just imagine it is thickening the blanket, you know, around you at night. And so how much carbon dioxide have we put in the atmosphere? This carbon dioxide is the most severe greenhouse gas because it stays around the longest. Methane actually traps more heat, but it dissipates after a handful of decades, while carbon dioxide sticks around. So this is a very famous graph from NASA that shows the atmospheric carbon dioxide going back 800,000 years. And there are normal variations in cycles, but you can see there's something very unusual going on just in the last few decades. And that's why the Earth is warming. So these are the temperatures of the land and the atmosphere and the oceans over the past 150 years or so, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the present. And so you can see those temperatures steadily increasing as the carbon dioxide came into the atmosphere, with it really taking off over the last 50, 60 years or so. And that blue one, the ocean one, is very important because when we talk about trapping heat into the Earth from increasing the greenhouse gases, 93% of that heat actually ends up in the ocean. Only 7% ends up warming the atmosphere in the land. So when you talk about the temperature is increased a certain amount or the land temperature is increased, That's only a small piece of what's actually going on. Most of that heat's getting trapped in the ocean, and that's having additional effects. So these are projections. What can we expect for temperature changes going forward, depending on what we do? So the gray area is if we have no climate policies at all. So if we do nothing to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then we will expect by 2100, the temperature, the average temperature on the planet will increase by somewhere in the 4 to 5 degree Celsius range, which is about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. If we enact the current policies, so in other words, all the laws that have been passed around the world to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if we actually carry out those laws, then we would expect by 2100 somewhere in the 3 to 4 degree centigrade or 6, 7 degree increase in Fahrenheit temperatures. If we honor all the pledges that have been made around the country but not actually implemented, so for example, the Paris Climate Accord, even though countries are mostly not doing what they said they were going to do, but if countries actually do what they've all pledged to do, then we're looking at 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius. And that's all well above what we really need to avoid the more severe effects, which is below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally below 1.5 degrees. So what does all this mean for actual impact? All right, let's take a look at the impact of 3 degrees Celsius, which is about where we'll be if we just do what countries have said they are going to do. By 2100, from a 3 degrees Celsius or about 5 degree Fahrenheit increase, we'll see sea levels rise probably 2 to 4 feet. There's some uncertainty there. It could be a little more, it could be a little less, but probably 2 to 4 feet. And then over the ensuing century, several meters in additional sea level rise. More intense storms and floods, considerably more than what we're seeing now. More severe heat waves and droughts. Declining forests. The rainforest cannot survive in a 3 degrees warmed atmosphere just because the fires will become too frequent and the dryness will be too much. So we would expect rainforests to almost entirely disappear. Coral reefs will disappear 90% or more, if not all. Mass extinctions on land and at sea. Food and water scarcity as agricultural patterns change, where the arable land is now will change. So imagine the entire Midwest being a dust bowl more permanently and agricultural land shifting up into Canada and all the changes that would require. And then climate refugees, large movements of people away from areas that are more difficult to live in, like imagine the American Southwest. If you have average temperatures well over 100 degrees, for 5 months of the year, some of those areas may become unlivable. So you'll have large mass movements of people and all the instability that causes. So this is just from a 3 degrees Celsius warming. This is just if we do the things that we say we're going to do. This even requires more than we're doing right now. If we don't do the things that are sort of named in the Paris Climate Accord, it will be worse than this. So here's a quick reality check that I sometimes, when I give these talks, I sometimes will hear people say, well, how do we know that 3 degrees Celsius warming is going to cause that much change? I mean, don't we have natural cycles in the Earth's history where the temperatures warm that much or more? The answer is yes, absolutely. We do have natural cycles where the Earth gets warmer and cooler, but not this quickly and not recently. And so what I love about this graph is that blue-purple region here. This is called the Holocene era, which is basically when human civilization arose, when agriculture started and people settled down and started building villages and cities. Human beings in their current biological form have been around for several 100,000 years, but we didn't see civilization take off until really this period here. And what's special about this period? A very stable climate. Over this 10,000 years or so, we've had fairly little variation in the climate, which is what has allowed human civilization to grow and flourish. Right now, we're outside of that zone for the first time in 800, in tens of thousands of years, or 10,000 years. And under these current projections, we're going to go way outside this zone just in the next few decades. So this is really a reality check that shows, yeah, what we're doing here is very unusual and a big change to what human beings have experienced throughout civilization. Okay, so that's the problem. What is CCL's particular solution? Now, there are a lot of ideas out there about how to deal with climate change, from government regulation to market approaches, to cooperative efforts. There's all sorts of different proposals and ideas. And CCL has tried to focus on solutions that can get a broad support across the political spectrum to make them actually able to be implemented and stable, and also ones that will be effective. And so this is what CCL has been pushing and is continuing to push. So first, what is CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby? It's a nonpartisan organization focused on building relationships with everyone, even those who oppose us. It's nonprofit, so volunteer-driven organization. We have about 190,000 members now in 612 local chapters around the country. Solution-focused, promote policies that can pass and will work, and respectful. And as you might note, this sounds very similar to Rotary. And as Sue has talks about a lot, it was a Rotarian that founded Citizens Climate Lobby. Okay, so what is our approach? The key insight that CCL's approach focuses on is what's called a negative externality. It's a market failure. The price of fossil fuels does not include the damage that fossil fuels cause. So when you pollute, if we burn a gallon of gasoline, or if a factory runs on dirty diesel fuel, it causes air pollution that has impacts down the line. And the people that put the pollution into the air don't pay for that. It's paid for by our kids and grandkids and future generations, or people that are in areas that get the brunt of the current climate impacts. So it's free to pollute. It's essentially, think of an analogy, if a company that has a factory process that generates toxic waste takes all that toxic waste and dumps it in public parks, right? Well, we don't allow that. We require people to clean up their own mess or to pay for the disposal of their own mess, but that is not true for burning fossil fuels. And that creates what economists call a negative externality. And it just creates incentive to do something that is free to you but costs money to other people. Okay, so what CCL's solution is to the carbon pollution problem and to this negative externality is what's called carbon fee and dividend. First, we place a fee on fossil fuels at the source. So the mine, where the coal is extracted, or the pipeline where the gas enters the United States, the port where a ship containing fossil fuels comes into the United States, where the fossil fuel enters the United States, enters the stream of commerce, we place a fee on it. And that fee is based on the amount of carbon dioxide that will be generated when the fuel is burned. Okay, so you calculate from the fuel how much carbon dioxide will get put in the air, and you charge a fee that's based on that amount of carbon dioxide. And then what we do with the fee is we return all of the revenue to households equally. And this is the key part here, is the word equally. So every family gets a dividend from this money. So the money goes into a pot from the carbon fees, and it gets distributed essentially to all American families equally based on how many people are in the family. And what that ends up meaning is that whether you come out ahead or behind depends on how much your carbon footprint is. So when the fee is put on the source, on the gas distributor, the miner, they pass most of that fee down the pipeline and ultimately ends up paid by the consumer, right? So if we put a fee on gasoline, if it's $10 per metric ton of carbon dioxide, that ends up translating to about 10 cents per gallon of gasoline. So the carbon fee at the source moves through the chain of commerce and gets paid by the people that actually buy and use the fuel. Then everyone gets an equal dividend. So if you are someone that uses more fossil fuels than the average person, you're going to pay more in fees than you will get back from this equal dividend. If you are someone who has a lower carbon footprint than normal, let's say you don't fly very much, you live in an apartment, you're in a lower income area, then the check you get back from the government, your dividend, is going to be higher than the extra fees you're paying, for your fuels. So in general, people who have low carbon footprint come out ahead financially. People who have high carbon footprint pay for it. So that's the basic principle. It uses economic incentives to change behavior. The price of fuels are higher, so people have incentive to use less. And that carbon impact is built into the price of products throughout the economy, including food. So if there's a particular food that requires a lot of carbon burning and fossil fuel burning to generate, that's reflected in the final price of the food, or anything you buy. It will reflect the amount of carbon that's burned to go into it. And that incentivizes companies to invest in clean energy to get their prices down. And it is fair to all concerned. Everyone pays for their own mess. Lower income folks are protected, which I will talk about in a minute, because lower income folks tend to have much smaller carbon footprints than higher income folks. And businesses know what to expect, and they can plan for the pricing of their inputs. So here's one example where this was implemented, and that's British Columbia. In 2008, British Columbia passed a carbon fee and rebate program fairly similar to the one we're doing here, though they used different tax credits as opposed to cash rebates. And as a result of their program, the per person consumption of fuels dropped by 16% during this period, while 16% during this period, while the rest of Canada it rose 3%. So it was a 19% drop in emissions. And there was a positive impact on the British Columbia economy. It improved more than the rest of Canada. And the popularity got increased over time. It was tough to get this passed in 2008, but it's become increasingly popular. And now it is being imported to the rest of Canada. So Canada is nationalizing the British Columbia carbon pricing example. So every province of Canada now has to come up with their own carbon pricing scheme. And if they don't, then one very much like British Columbia or like our bill gets implemented automatically. So, and it's popular. In the last Canadian election, 2/3 of Canadians voted for a minister who favored carbon pricing. Okay, so what bill specifically are we introducing to implement this idea? The federal bill that Citizens Climate Lobby sponsors is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And at the end, I'll show you there's a website that has lots and lots of detail about it. It currently has 82 co-sponsors in the House, and Citizens Climate Lobby insists on it being bipartisan. So we had an original Republican and Democrat sponsor together. Ted Deutsch is the original Democratic sponsor, and a congressman in Florida who's since been defeated was the original Republican sponsor, but now we have Francis Rooney, another Republican, who stepped in, though he's retiring. So Citizens Climate Lobby really wants to keep this bipartisan, to get it, have a chance to move through, and it's working constantly on recruiting Republican sponsors. And the specifics of it: it imposes a fee of $15 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted on all fossil fuels. That fee rises $10 per year until emissions drop 90% from a starting point. The dividend that's payback, so in other words, we collect this money from that fee and then it's given to all households equally. The dividend starts at about $500 per year for a family of 4. And over, I believe it's a dozen years, it gets to over $4,400 a year for a family of 4. So right off the bat, every family gets a check for about $500 a year. And depending on how much fossil fuel you use, you'll end up coming out ahead or behind. We also add a border carbon fee. So fuels that come in through the border pay the carbon fee right when they enter, and that's obviously to prevent businesses from relocating to somewhere where there isn't a carbon fee. And it has a pause on greenhouse gas regulations from the EPA for 10 years to give this a chance to work. But if it doesn't work, then any emissions from the EPA get reinstated if it doesn't go down 30% in, I believe it's 10 years. There's a certain amount of time. So that's the specifics of the bill. And we did a study, or Citizens Climate Lobby sponsored a study in 2014 on what the impact would be in different areas for essentially this bill. There was slight differences back then, but essentially this bill. And it would cause a 33% drop in carbon dioxide emissions over 10 years. And over 20 years, it would drop 52%. It would create 2.1 million jobs over 10 years. And that's basically from spurring investment in green energy programs. It would have a positive effect on the economy by reducing some of the waste from fossil fuels. And they measured that at about 75 billion per year after 6 years. And then another important factor here is health. Carbon dioxide itself doesn't cause health problems, but when you burn fossil fuels, there's a lot of other stuff in there, the particulate matter, that does cause health problems, asthma, lung disease, other problems. And this study found that over 20 years, just from better air quality, you would save over 200,000 lives just from the impact of the carbon dioxide, from the emissions reductions from this bill. Okay, and I talked a little bit about the benefits to low-income Americans. This is an even more recent study from 2020 that tries to assess the impact on each household. What would be, depending on their income. So this graph here divides American households into 5 quintiles. Basically, each is 20%. Quintile 5 is the wealthiest 20% in the country. Quintile 1 is the poorest 20%. And what this shows is that for quintile 1, the poorest 20%, 92% of families will actually have a positive financial benefit. In other words, they will get back more money from the rebates than they spend on the extra fees. And as you can see there, it's a couple $100 per person. The highest quintile will have a slight loss. More will have a slight loss, not a huge loss. It's a couple, 0.2% of their income. But it will be a slight loss because higher income folks tend to fly more, live in larger houses, heat their houses to warmer temperatures, and drive larger cars. So just from a fairness standpoint, not only does this cause people that use the fuels to pay for it, but it also doesn't impose big impacts on lower income people. It actually is a net financial benefit toward them. Okay, so Massachusetts effort. So that's the federal bill, and I can talk a minute about its prospects, but Massachusetts and other states are also trying to pass similar bills. In the last legislative session that's ending now, we had a bill called the Benson bill, which was fairly similar. The one difference was it rebated 70% to households and employers, but 30% of the revenues were held for a green infrastructure fund. So that was the bill we've been pushing for the last 2 years. There were earlier versions that we pushed before that. And it got quite a bit of support. We had 96 out of 180 members of the House co-sponsored it, but we still couldn't get it out of committee because the leadership in the Massachusetts House was not in favor of it. And they have essentially complete control over what legislation comes to the floor. So even though we had a majority pledging support to it, we couldn't get it out of committee. The Senate in the Massachusetts passed a fairly extensive climate bill that only had sort of vague language about having the governor impose a market mechanism. That bill and a different measure that's passed by the House are now in a conference committee, and we're all kind of waiting to see what happens. So we don't expect we're going to get comprehensive carbon pricing out of this legislative session, but we're continuing to push for it. And worldwide, carbon pricing is gaining steam. There are some versions of carbon pricing in 46 countries. Most of those are cap and trade systems. Some, such as Scandinavia, have straight carbon taxes that go into general revenue. Other than Canada, I don't believe there's one that has the specific CCL approach of fee and rebate, but it's under consideration in a lot of places. Okay, so what do I think the impacts will be, or what do I think the prospects will be now that we've had the election? So it doesn't really change much about what CCL is doing. CCL really believes that the only way we're going to get serious climate legislation is to have bipartisan support. And that would have been true whether we had a dominant Democratic Congress or a split government like we may have. Because to get things through and to get them to be stable, it really does need buy-in across the political spectrum. Because if you have something passed with just one party's support, then when that party loses power, it can be undone. So we really do want to get bipartisan support. And we feel like with what appears to be a divided government, that this is a bill that can appeal to conservatives and progressives. And it would be effective, it would make progress. It's not a complete solution to climate change, but we feel like this is one that does have prospects to advance if we can just get some more momentum building. And there's resistance on the far right, of course, there's resistance on the far left, but we feel like this is the kind of compromise bill that can appeal to everybody's values and can move forward. So we're going to work on it hard over the next couple of years. Whether it's going to pass or not, I don't know. But we do feel like this is one of the approaches that has a chance to move forward, while other ones in a divided Congress probably do not. So if you're interested in more information on Citizens Climate Lobby, you can reach out to me or to Sue. And here's a couple of websites that talk about the specific bill, and both in the federal bill and Massachusetts efforts, or you can just email me or email Sue, and we can provide you with a lot more information if you wanted to get involved specifically. So let me now open up to questions and see if I can get back to my grid view to see you all. Okay, I think I can see people. So anyone that wants to have a comment or a question, just please unmute and fire away.
All right, I guess I'll go. Hi, David.
Yeah,
Thank you.
go ahead, Elias.
Okay.
It was great. A lot of good information. Just, off the top of my head, it seems on face value like a great solution, or at least a step in the right direction towards a solution for curbing climate change. But one of the things that really worry that I see maybe a problem is our competitiveness as a country. If we're going to be taxing everything at the base level of fuel, that means everything inherently is going to go up, and that might decrease our competitiveness in the global market. And the impacts of that on the country could be great. I'd like to know more about that if you have those answers. So
one thing that the bill does include is a border tax. So anything that is manufactured outside of the United States, if it's imported in, then a carbon fee is imposed on it at the time it's imported. So it assesses what carbon went into manufacturing the product, and they impose that at the border. And that's to prevent, part of what you're talking about, which is manufacturing moving away from where the carbon tax is implemented. So anything that's made in a place that doesn't have an equivalent carbon tax would get hit at the border with an import fee. So that deals with some of it. And so that, I think that would try to reduce any imbalance that might come from, or disadvantage might come from that. Does that answer your question, or is there a broader concern?
No, it is a broader concern because, what you're suggesting is a type of tariff on incoming goods, and that's a very debatable subject in the world of economics, whether they're good or bad. It depends on who you talk to. But I just wanted to know what your solution or what your approach towards that was, and your answer covers it.
Yeah. Okay. And and tariffs, you're right. There's a complication of implementing tariffs, but the idea is it's an equalizing tariff, to equalize as opposed to punish.
How do they figure out what the cost is of the fuel used in other countries for manufacture?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Pretty complicated.
Yeah, and I don't know that would be done in the text of the bill. I think that's probably something that's implemented through regulation. I don't know if you know anything more about that, Sue. Yeah, I know certainly. Yeah, I know that I imagine it would be something that would be done through the regulatory process. So maybe the manufacturer would certify something, or they, I don't know. That's a good question though. But I imagine that's the kind of detail that gets implemented probably at the executive branch level. Susan Rack, I think.
Well, I think I know the answer to this, David, but our state rep, Tommy Vitola, do you know where he sits on this state proposed legislation?
I'd have to look him up. Do you remember, Sue, offhand?
I don't. I can try and look it up while we're chatting.
I'm pretty sure the Brookline rep is a supporter. But I can show his name sounds familiar.
I would be surprised if he wasn't.
Yeah, in Massachusetts, the majority of reps support it. The resistance comes from various areas, but mostly South Shore and North Shore, and Central Mass is where we have a little bit more trouble.
I see climate change in a much broader thing. I'm concerned about things like methane from cows and alternative energy sources. If we were to reduce the carbon output to zero, we would still have climate change. So how are you integrating this plan in with the broader goal of keeping the overall climate temperature increase to 2%?
So I was using carbon dioxide as a shorthand there. It's really greenhouse gas emissions. So all greenhouse gases are included in this, including methane. So methane is a more potent greenhouse gas. It's I think it traps about 80% or 80 times as much heat as carbon dioxide, but it does dissipate over, I think, like 70 years. I don't remember the exact number, whereas carbon dioxide sticks around longer. So it's debatable which is worse, probably carbon dioxide, but you're right. It does deal with all greenhouse gas emissions.
And how are we going to fund alternative energy sources? Because what I see starting at the beginning of civilization is this struggle to eliminate the only energy sources as being the sun and human power. That's what all of this civilization has been about, using other sources of energy. And if we eliminate fossil fuels and all these other things we do that are so destructive to the atmosphere, where are we going to find the energy to keep ourselves running?
Yeah. So two answers to that. I mean, one of the advantages of this sort of market approach that CCL uses is it doesn't try to pick, what should we all switch to and mandate that. It sort of lets the market figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
It makes the fuels more expensive based on the damage they do. And then over time, the economy will shift towards more things like solar and wind, possibly nuclear, things that have zero emission. And it'll just give those more of an, I shouldn't say an advantage, it'll give them equality versus the fossil fuels. And so over time, they will supplant them. How fast that occurs depends on the economics of it. So if that's the problem with saying, okay, we're going to eliminate all fossil fuels, we're going to ban fracking, we're going to ban coal use next week. What's going to replace that? We don't have the renewables yet to get there, but we will over time. So the idea of this sort of approach is you let that build over time and you give it a push. Now, there's also the second answer good there is this doesn't preclude more funding for other alternative energy sources. So this is just puts in the pricing mechanism and the market force, but there's nothing stopping this. This doesn't preclude taking other general revenue and funding solar research or R&D on fuel cells or whatever, or nuclear, and I would hope actually that this would not be, the only thing we do, that we also do some of that direct R&D funding, which can go a long way as well. But this sort of understands that there's going to be a gradual transition. We want that transition to be as fast as we can, but without, massive disruptions and power outages and things like that.
And I have one last question. How does EIDCA differ from cap and trade?
So it's a both use pricing, but it's a different framework. So what cap and trade does is the government sets a cap on emissions. Okay, so like California has a cap and trade thing. All right, we are going to set our carbon dioxide emissions for the state at X. And then we will sell credits, or we'll give credits to different companies to do a percentage of that X, and then they can trade those credits. So it's sort of the opposite approach. You start with the limit, and then you work down from that by letting the economics work down from there and let people trade those limits around. And then you so you start with a limit and come down. And the carbon pricing approach says, all right, let's start with the price based on the damage it does, and then see, how the limits evolve. And it's two different approaches. And there are problems with cap and trade, about, there are ways that it can be unfair because it basically means the wealthier, companies can put the pollution in areas where there are more poor people. There's all sorts of things that happen with that have to be adjusted, but it's better than nothing. But I think CCL feels like the price and rebate ends up being a more flexible approach.
So I looked up Tommy Vitolo. He's a state representative. So CCL, our data that I can access at least doesn't track his support or not. We just do the national.
Oh, all right.
Yeah,
So
I can look that up. I'll look it
Yeah.
up. Yeah, there's Massachusetts has its own website. I can try to do that
Yeah.
very quickly here if I can get to my master sheet. Let's see. And I'll try to look him up real quick. So Vitolo.
It was interesting though. It was Kennedy. Kennedy was the
No, he was
Brookline.
not. He was a
Yeah,
problem.
he was
Yeah.
Brookline.
Yeah,
So
okay.
he
Tommy Vitolo is a co-sponsor of the Massachusetts bill,
Okay.
There you go.
yeah, which doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
It's interesting
So-
that one of the things that took down Joe Kennedy was that Markey had been in, in front of this issue for so long. So it was kind of interesting for us at least to see that happening.
And where is your guy in Newton? Who's now
Jake
my guy?
Aukenschloss.
Yeah.
He's a supporter. In fact,
We think,
we're pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to be meeting with him. I'm actually the liaison to this district for his office for this district. So usually we would talk to him in December, but he hasn't taken office yet. But we're trying to kind of get a preliminary meeting with him, and I'm going to try and surprise him at the city tree lighting next week. See if I can get in a word in edgewise.
I'll be curious how you find him, Sue.
Yeah, all indications are that he'll be a supporter.
So in Massachusetts,
And in
so
fact, I
far-
think he even mentioned this bill in one of his debates.
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
bill.
I know who is it that's been talking to him already? There's one of our members has had some
Yeah.
conversation. But yeah, only Massachusetts, only 2 of the 9 reps have actually endorsed this particular bill. And that's Seth Moulton and McGovern are the 2 that have. And we're working on the others. And I think our sense is we get resistance from the right, of course, not all the right, but some. But we also do get some resistance from some on the left that just they want to talk about the Green New Deal and don't want to talk about, now. So our answer to that is this could be part of a Green New Deal. It's not exclusive. It's a piece that can pass and works. But that's some of the resistance we have on the left. We'll see whether the election changes that. I mean, I think there was a sense that we were going to have a big majority, the Democrats were going to have a big majority in the House, and so they would have a little bit more ability to dictate, but that may not be the case. So, we'll see. I mean, we work on Catherine Clark, who's my rep, and her answer to us is, I love this bill, but you got to get a majority of Democrats to publicly endorse it before I will, So we hear a lot of that sort of thing.
Leading from behind.
Yes, right.
Can I ask a
Mary
question?
Louise? Yeah.
What does the impact of electric cars have to do with all this?
Well, this would create incentive for electric cars, so right now, my feeling is gas burning cars, internal combustion engines, are essentially subsidized by our next generation, paying for the damage they cause, while we get to drive them around without paying for the pollution they cause. So electric cars are coming anyway. But I think a bill like this, where you put some additional pricing on the fuel, will speed it up some. Honestly, with the numbers on this bill, I don't think it'll speed it up a lot, because in the first few years, the tax on the fuel is going to be, less than $1. And I think most of the data shows when you tax gas at 50 cents or less, it doesn't really impact how much people drive. It takes quite a bit more. So I don't know that this will accelerate electric cars specifically, but I think it will have more of a economy-wide impact by forcing, manufacturers, electricity providers and whatnot to rethink their sourcing.
And one of the things that's interesting about this bill, and why it is supported by so many conservatives, is that it doesn't identify a particular industry or technology to support it. It's market-based, right? It lets the market figure out what's the right way to go and how to get there. And that's one of the reasons we're getting bipartisan support is that it doesn't say, oh, we're going to give you. I mean, I personally just bought an electric car and I'm getting some rebates, and I love that. But that may or may not be the right thing to do, right? So this lets the market work that out.
Yeah, and one example of that, when we were redoing our house when I bought it 7 years ago, we were looking at what to do for heating, for HVAC. And I was very interested, what about geothermal? Can we dig a geothermal well and do that? And there were huge federal tax credits for it. So you get 30% of what you spend drilling this like $20,000 well gets paid for by the government. Then when we researched it, we found out that just putting in mini splits, the little, heat pump mini splits with no well, actually performs just as well as geothermal for most houses. So that drilling that $20,000 well is a complete waste of money, but the federal government was going to pay for a third of it, because at some point people decided geothermal was the way to go, when it turned out the technology caught up and the air source heat pumps pretty much are just as good now. So that's one problem with trying to pick, which industry is actually going to be the best at reducing carbon emissions. Sometimes you just need to let the market figure it out.
And the technology is just moving so fast.
Yeah.
There's no way to keep up.
Yeah, solar. I mean, no one predicted solar would be this cheap. Right now it's in most places, it's actually cheaper to build a new solar power plant than it is to operate with an existing coal power plant. And nobody thought that was going to be the case 10 years ago. And that's even though fossil fuels are still essentially subsidized. So this bill eliminates that sort of subsidy and gives it an extra push. I mean, coal would disappear very fast if this bill were put in place.
I'll tell you a funny story. About 8 years ago, I was managing a HUD building here in Brighton, and we got an energy retrofit grant from HUD. And so we had a flat roof that was an old black roof, and we had put in that we wanted a reflective roof and possibly solar panels. Anyways, what HUD does in its infinite wisdom is they send an engineer out first to analyze your requests. And they sent us somebody from Arizona. Not that there wasn't anybody from New England who could have done this, but they sent somebody from Arizona who then proceeded to tell us he really didn't have a lot of knowledge of solar power and solar energy. Plus, New England's winters were so long, solar was not efficient here in New England. And so they denied our request. David, thank you so much for joining us. That was a terrific
Yeah,
presentation.
thank you. I'm happy to stay as long as anyone has more questions. So.
I also want to let everybody know that there is a new committee in the district, environmental committee, that's being developed in case anybody's interested in looking at that. Our goal, I'm one of the co-chairs with Elliot Rittenberg, and our goal is to educate the clubs about the new area of focus, the environmental area of focus.
Thank you, Sue. I forgot
So-
to mention that. Thank you.
If you're interested, let me know. We're just in the beginning stages, so get in on the ground floor.
Environment is the new 7th area of focus for Rotary
Woo!
International.
Yay!
We are very urban here in Brookline Rotary, which is really very appropriate because Brookline's urban. But I think some of us probably don't have a great deal of contact or involvement in rural areas. And some of the stuff, some of the needs, some of the demands are different. And I think that politically, because there's been a lot of politic talk, I think it's easy to create. It's easy to create pushback from people about energy-related issues. People who live at longer distances from necessary services, for example, have to drive a lot more. Where our place in Maine, it's 17 miles to a grocery store, almost that far to a gas station, for that matter. And the town of Norway, Maine has electric refueling, as it were, but many places don't. So it's simply that there is a necessity, and there is so much in this country of people lining up on different sides of the same issue and saying, you don't understand us, and your ideas are stupid and they won't work. And I hope we can eliminate that, or at least downplay it by having a better understanding of what's good for inside 128 is not necessarily what's good for Route 35 in the middle of the forest in Maine, or Route 10, Highway 10 in North Carolina, which I also have property.
So you're right about rural areas, and that actually CCL focuses on that quite a bit. And so one slide I can show you here is they did some in that 2020 household study. Let me see if I can share this again. Okay, can you guys see?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here, let me. I can probably see it as it is. So this is showing the impact on. I showed you that one on impact based on income level or wealth level. This is one based on where people live, and urban households do come out a little bit better than suburb or rural, but not much. This actually spreads out pretty evenly. So rural communities, 53% of households will get more money back than they put in, and 27% will have a minor loss. And that's really because you're right that people in rural areas tend to drive a little bit more. But they also tend to have less income and fly less. And they tend to have houses that maybe don't require as much heat. So there is an advantage for the urban dweller in an apartment, especially low income urban dwellers in apartments will come out the best out of this, but they also use the least carbon, but rural areas are not hugely disadvantaged like they would be by a straight gas tax, for example, because this is economy wide.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It was really the latter I was thinking about, a solution that only solves a little bit and creates bigger problems down the road.
But of course, in some rural areas, like areas where coal is still an employer, there's not very much of that left. Actually, the coal industry, I think, employs less than 100,000 people now. But those areas are still going to, of course, be opposed to anything that puts fees on carbon. The gas industry is more mixed on this. It's really quite interesting. The gas industry actually likes this bill, but only if we have a higher carbon fee. So think about that for a minute. The natural gas industry, Shell and whatnot, they actually endorse bills, but they want a much higher initial fee. Anyone want to guess why that is?
No.
The reason
Lower pollution from gas than there is from coal,
Bingo.
or from oil, for that matter.
Right. It's a dynamic where this fee is based on the amount of greenhouse gas it emits. Coal is twice as bad as natural gas. So the gas companies figure, hey, if you put a huge fee per carbon emissions on fuels right away, coal disappears very quickly. Renewables won't be there yet. We will grab that market share. And so the gas companies actually like this idea because they're smart enough to realize their days are numbered too. And there's probably 20, 25 years left for the fossil fuel industry in the US, as a big player. And so they want to grab as much of that market share as they can in the short term. And so they actually like the idea of pricing coal out of the market. So they grab that market share temporarily, and then they get phased out over time as well as the renewables come up to speed versus all of it being phased out steadily. So it's an interesting, and of course, from an environmental perspective, that's great. We'd rather have gas than coal. We have to choose in the short term. Yeah, George?
Is there much coal use, industrial coal use, because there's virtually no coal use at the household or or buildings level? But is there much coal still in use in the U.S. rather than it all getting exported somewhere?
For electricity generation, yes, it's still a major one of the players for electricity generation. Yes, major. I think gas has passed it now, but not by a huge amount. It's still, I think it's number 2. Do you know? I don't know if anybody else knows the details. I can look that up.
No, I just wondered.
But yeah, no, there's still quite a bit of coal. So I'd have to go to my backup slides here. I'm pretty sure I've got one on energy use. Let's see, emission sources. So let's see.
I think it's electricity generation.
Yeah, it's pretty much all electricity. I'm wondering how much coal is still being used, but there's still quite a bit.
Okay.
Interesting side story. My husband and I drove our new plug-in hybrid car to Colorado in August, and it was surprising. There were charging stations everywhere. There's a little, if you're interested, even if you don't have a car, there's an app called Plug Share. You can just download it and take a look. It's amazing. Especially in Maine. Maine has a ton of charging stations. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But I was pleasantly surprised at how often we could schedule book a hotel that had a charging station. Really was surprisingly easier than I thought. There are a couple places that are thin, but with our car, we can just plug it into a regular wall plug, so that works out too. Yeah,
and so really the electrification of cars is great by itself, but it also needs to go hand in hand with changing the energy source. Right. So if you're driving an electric car in an area that gets its electricity from coal, it's still better than a gas car, but not that much. But if it's in an area of gas or especially more renewables, then that's ideal. So that's the two things. That'll go a long way if we shift transportation to electric and build those wind farms. Those offshore wind farms, near Martha's Vineyard, and really ramp that sort of thing up. That's, can have a huge impact.
Does Brookline offer electricity from renewables? Newton does. I know we can opt into 100% renewable energy. Do you guys have something like that?
Yes.
Yeah, I figured you would.
It helps. That's, but still that itself doesn't really create, new, it's not the same as building a wind farm.
No,
it's
but
just- yeah.
when I charge my electric car, I charge it with renewable energy, which
Yeah.
feels better.
Yeah, it just means that it puts more money for the town to seek out renewable, but it doesn't actually create the new, renewable
Right.
sources. So,
Right.
so getting that wind farm built and all those built is huge. Getting more rooftop solar is really important. The point of view solar, and hopefully as those prices continue to come down, we'll see that more. I think California's talking about requiring every new house to have solar, which would be a good
Yeah.
step.
I have solar panels on the roof of my building, and it reduces my electric bill to hovering around zero all year, including air conditioning season.
Yeah.
Brookline passed something about new buildings last year. It was struck down in court. What was that? That was.
Oh, that was, it would be illegal to do gas hookups to a new building. And I think that was thrown out.
Yeah, that was thrown out.
I mean-
Great. Well, thanks, Dave.
Anyway,
Thank you.
Thank you
Good to
very
see
much.
you.
It was great.
Okay, so if you guys, anybody wants to get involved in CCL or just have more questions, you can reach me through Sue, or if you got my email, I don't know. And you guys are free to, I told other Sue, she's free to circulate the slides, that I had. So, and it's got my name on there too. If anybody wants them, you can ask her or ask Sue Panini.
I appreciate it, David. Thank you for your time. It was very informative. And everyone else, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Bye-bye. Good to see
Okay, thanks
everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye,
Thanks,
y'all.
David.
Bye-bye.